Hey, Dr. Robertson.
Hey, Dr. Mosley, how are you today?
Doing good, doing good. What are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about booze.
Ooh.
And more specifically, we're going to talk about spirits or liquor.
Mm-hmm.
And even more specifically, we're going to talk about ones that have been aged in barrels called brown goods.
I love nothing more than a good aged spirit.
Yeah. So that's one of the things that the students will notice when I'm talking about this topic is that distilled beverages are called spirits. And so we have the distinction. We have wine, which is the yeast eat the sugar in the grapes and they make wine. We have beer, where the yeast eat sugar in the barley or the grain and make beer. And then we have spirits, where the yeast eat the sugar in something, and then we take whatever that liquid is that has the sugar and the alcohol in it, and we basically boil it, collect the steam, and we take that steam and condense it, and that makes spirits. It's a way to increase the concentration of alcohol in our drink. So this is why, beer has about 5% alcohol, wine has about 12%, but with spirits we can go up to about 95% alcohol. Typically we come in at about 40%, or what's called 80 proof.
Yeah. I tend not to touch anything high.
Yeah.
That's just me.
So, that's a good thing to talk about. I'll just kind of briefly talk about the process of distillation. So distillation is just what I've described, that we've made something like beer. You can take beer or wine and distill them, but you take something with alcohol in it and you put it in a vessel and you heat that vessel. Now, the water, we all know, turns to steam around 212 degrees, but alcohol turns to steam around 178 degrees.
Oof.
So by heating this stuff in a vessel, the first steam that comes off of it is mostly alcohol. Damn. So what we're able to do is collect that. When the water stays behind, we collect the alcohol. Now we've concentrated that. And so if you run it through distillation several times, you increase the strength. And that's how we get the varying strengths of spirits. Is, we can easily go up to about 140 proof or 70% alcohol through distillation. And then what commonly happens is we've got this very strong alcohol, and then it is blended with distilled water to bring it back down to the concentration of alcohol that we sell it at. So, when you go in the liquor store and you see that bottle there, it was distilled to a very high alcohol content and then mixed with water to water it down to the point where it's sold at 80 proof or 40%. And that's the way that usually works. Okay. And if you've ever seen a movie or any drawings or illustrations or anything of moonshiners, that's why they have the pot with the copper tube coming out of it that curls. That curly pipe is supposed to cool the steam to collect the alcohol that then drips into the little jug with the 3 X's on it. And what the 3 X's are for?
Isn't that, well, I mean, I know what it is for root beer. Root beer, it's a symbol of quality. So if it has 3 X's, it's a high quality root beer.
Well, sort of here. If it's been distilled once and it's weak, it's 1X. If it's been distilled twice and it's stronger, it's 2X. If it's been distilled 3 times and it's about as strong as it can get, it's 3X.
Yeah, I would probably be staying away from that third one.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk about brown goods. So there are 2 basic categories of spirits that we talk about. What are called light goods or white goods, and then brown goods. And so brown goods are spirits that have been aged in barrels. And curiously enough, they came first. And it's odd because you would think that the simpler process that doesn't have this extra step of aging it in barrel would be the product that came first. But that's not the case, because generally alcohol, green alcohol as it's called, immediately after it's distilled, isn't very palatable. This is, and that's what we think of as moonshine.
Yeah.
Often, is this fresh green alcohol that hasn't been aged in a barrel. And the aging process in the barrel does a lot of things to it. The barrels are typically oak. Typically American oak is the best oak for making barrels, and we'll talk about this with some of the products as we go through them. But they take that barrels and they set the inside of the barrel on fire. They char it. So the inside of the barrel, the wood, is charcoal. And what happens is they fill the barrel with the green alcohol after it's been distilled. It's not green, it's just called green like it's fresh.
Mm-hmm.
It's not colored green, but they put it in there and they let it sit. And you want to put it somewhere where it gets some variation in temperature throughout the day and throughout the year. So Matt, what happens to things as they heat up? Like if you take something and heat it up, what physical changes does it undergo?
Usually if it's a liquid, it's going to evaporate or like the wood will expand.
It'll expand, yeah.
You know,
so part of it will evaporate, and the part that's lost to evaporation is called the angel's share. But as it expands, the liquid that's in the barrel, it actually creates pressure, and it pushes some of the whiskey into the wood, into the fibers and into the grain of the wood.
Mm.
And then as it cools and it shrinks, it pulls it back out. So if you've heard of charcoal filtration, that's what's happening here, is this alcohol is being pushed into the wood by the expansion due to temperature, and then it's being pulled out as it cools. And so it undergoes this dozens or hundreds of times as it's aged, and it filters out the impurities. It picks up flavor from the barrels. One of the natural flavors, natural compounds that occurs in oak barrels is a chemical called vanillin, for instance. And what would you think vanillin tastes like?
It sounds a lot like vanilla, so I'm going to go with that.
That is the flavor of vanilla. So the flavor of vanilla actually comes from the oak barrel. So when you get a bourbon, it has these hints of vanilla. It really does, but it comes from the oak barrel. So as the brown good, as the alcohol is put in the barrel, and it goes through this cycle of expansion and contraction, expansion and contraction, expansion and contraction, it filters and changes the flavor of the raw alcohol and makes it taste better. And so this is a 2-year, 3-year, 12-year process. You know, generally the longer it goes, the better, the smoother, the more flavor compounds you're going to pick up, the smoother the flavor, you're going to lose more impurities, and it's generally better. Now, brown goods historically, if you think about it, and it makes sense, were for very, very, very wealthy people. The average person couldn't afford them. Because Matt, you know, think about it, you're a working guy, you're out there, you're a dirt farmer. Can you afford to take 50 pounds of corn and set it aside, a couple $100 worth of corn, and I'm going to drink this in 8 years?
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
You can't afford it. So
no.
That brown goods were expensive because of the time that it took to age them. So for the most part, these were considered to be luxury goods. And so in the first spirits were these brown goods because the raw alcohol didn't taste good. So we had to age it in barrels to make it more palatable. And so that's how we got Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, bourbon, all these various distinctions, different types of whiskeys. And so those are brown goods. Brown goods are spirits that have been aged in barrels. So now we're going to talk about some of them. A little bit about the distilling process, which is the process of creating this higher concentration of alcohol. We're going to start with some sort of grain. Bourbon is famously, by definition, at least 51% corn. Rye whiskey, 51% rye. All different sorts of grains can be used to make spirits. And what we're looking for is around 60% starch in the grain and about 13% moisture. This is ideal. This is the right amount. So we take the grain and we grind it up. So you take it, and essentially you take the corn, you turn it into grits. So we grind it up, and then there's the mash process. So we take this ground up grain and we moisten it. Now, think about, that green fuzzy thing that you have found in the back of your refrigerator before. you know, that is a little bit moist and there's some food in there and something starts to grow. That's what we're looking for here is we moisten the grain and we intentionally mix in some yeast, but we moisten the grain. So now it's going to start undergoing some changes. And one of those changes is it's going to sprout. The grain, even though it's ground up, will start to sprout. And what happens when it sprouts is it undergoes a process called distase. Now, what that is normally in a grain, the food is stored as starch. But when it sprouts, it needs to be converted into a form that the plant can use right now, which is what's called sugar.
Yeah.
So distase, when you sprout the grain, it undergoes distase. So it turns the starch into sugar because the sugar is what the yeast eats. So now the grain is full of sugar. We warm it up. It's moist. We mix in some yeast, and the yeast are happy. You know, they go to town. They got all this food. And yeast give off two things: carbon dioxide and alcohol.
Wow.
So they eat sugar and they poop out carbon dioxide and alcohol.
They came here to do two things: create
Yeah.
alcohol, produce carbon dioxide.
And so that goes up, you know, we'll allow that to go, and it hits about 9% alcohol. So if you were to do, you know, if you were to grind up barley and use it, essentially you're making beer at this point. You know, it's not that different from beer. But that 8 or 9% alcohol mixture there is called the wash. Okay, so now we take the wash, and we put it into the distill, or we put it in the still where it is distilled. So distillation is this process that I told you about, where the alcohol turns to steam at a lower temperature than the water, and we collect that alcohol steam. Now, if we do it at higher heat, we get more alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
If we do it at lower heats, we get more flavor compounds. So it's this, you know, we're always looking for that balance of what's going to taste good versus what's going to give us the most alcohol. There are two types of stills. There's what's called a continuous still and what's called a pot still. So a pot still came first. And a pot still is just what it sounds like. It's a pot. So it's a big vessel that's sealed and has a copper tube coming out of it. If you've ever seen that, like in an old movie or something, that picture of the pot on the fire with the copper tube coming out the top, that is a pot still. And so what the pot still does is you can make one batch at a time. You put the wash in, you heat it up, you collect it, then you have to clean the pot out and start over. A continuous still is a more industrial process, but basically you put the wash in the bottom and the alcohol comes out the top. It's a more complicated process, but basically you can continually add wash to the bottom and continually get alcohol out the top, so you don't have to stop and clean it.
That's kind of handy, especially if you're doing bulk.
It is. And so for less expensive spirits, they tend to be done in continuous stills. And for the fancy, expensive ones that cost a lot, that are artisan, those are done in pot stills, small batch.
Yeah, we fancy like that sometimes.
Yeah, we're fancy lads. So if you do, the first distillation will produce what's called low wine, and then the second one will produce what's called high wine or new whiskey. So this is the green alcohol. This is the new whiskey. The stuff that's left over is called slop. It's fed to pigs or cattle.
I mean, they got to get a little buzz on too, so why not?
Well, I mean, it's grain.
I know.
You know,
I know.
And we've cooked out most of the alcohol, so.
Yeah, we ruined it for all of them. So then we need to mature it, huh?
Yeah, so this is the point, you know, somewhere around 120 to 140 proof. And it's put into barrels. If it's higher than that, the flavors can get kind of weird. It'll develop woody flavors, but around 120 to 140 proof, it's then if it needs to, it's, you know, maybe it's blended down a little. There's some distilled water added to it, but it goes in the barrel. It goes into the charcoal, the charred barrel, and that's where the temperature cycling happens that I told you about. where it expands, it contracts, expands and contracts. It's pushing it into the fibers of the woods and then pulling it out. And over, say, 4 years, you'll lose about 15%. So there's the angel share, which is the stuff that evaporates. And then
Devil's share.
Yeah, is that Jim Beam?
Yeah, it gets soaked into the wood.
Yeah, so since it's doing this temperature cycling, the bourbon is being pressed into the wood. So what they've found they can do is take the wood and put it in a press and squeeze this last bit of
Give it back. Give it
alcohol
back.
out. So it's a way to recover some lost product, and if you can make some money off of it, more power to them.
Well, and also, I mean, that's just marketing genius. You might as well, if you're going to just get rid of the barrels.
Well, see, that's an interesting thing, because when we get into this talking about Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey, they like to use old bourbon barrels because that imparts a more complex flavor to their product. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, they sell the barrels after they use them.
Yeah, and some like to use wine barrels before and all sorts of stuff.
The barrels. There's an interesting trade in barrels around the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so brown spirits. These are also known as brown goods. These are the ones that are aged in wood. Mm-hmm. They can be blended or they can be straight. Mm-hmm. And some examples are bourbon, which is 51% corn and traditionally comes from Kentucky. And there are a lot of rules on how it's made to have that name. There's Canadian whiskey. There's Irish whiskey. There's what's called light whiskey, rye whiskey, Scotch whiskey, and Tennessee sipping whiskey. So there are lots of distinctions here of different types. Now, the word whiskey, it is a Celtic word. It comes from Ireland, Scotland, and it means the water of life.
It totally makes sense that Ireland would come up with some word for booze.
Matt, you're treading on dangerous ground there, talking, stereotyping a whole group of people like that.
I'm just saying, when I went over there, everybody was drinking for the most part. So it was...
And since I am married, my wife is a good Irish lass. Yeah. I am not going to comment.
Yeah, no, that's safe. That's safe.
When I met my wife, her maiden name is Gilliam McKinney Dunnigan. So it doesn't get any more Irish than that.
Yeah.
So whiskey means the water of life, which is funny because that's a term that pops up on a lot of any country that makes whiskey, whatever their historical whiskey is for their country, they called it the water of life. It's kind of funny, like any kind of ancient people, they discover alcohol and distillation, like, holy crap, this stuff is great. What is it? It's the water of life. So aquavit, if you've ever heard that, means water of life. Whiskey means water of life. There are a lot of these that mean water of life.
All right.
So whiskey in America usually comes in between 80 and 190 proof. It's made from grain, and it can be flavored, like Fireball.
Yeah.
Which I don't even want to talk about.
No. I mean,
or Southern Comfort.
Yeah.
Or Yukon Jack.
I mean, here's the thing. Mistakes get made when we're young.
Yeah.
So, I'm sure y'all make similar mistakes at some point, but I hope you don't.
Whiskeys are commonly blended, but not always. And the blends typically have a 20% what's called straight whiskey. They usually come in about 80 proof. And they're supposed to be no more than 49% of any one type of grain. Although if they have more, if they're at least 51, then they could get some special labeling like Calvert Extra and Seagram 7. But we'll talk about blended whiskeys when we get into Canadian whiskey. So bourbon. Bourbon is really the king of American whiskeys, I would say.
Well, and it's got a special place in my heart, man. Nothing more fun than doing the Bourbon Trail up in Kentucky.
It is an amazing tourist destination opportunity where you go through and you visit all the 12 distilleries where they make bourbon.
It's beautiful up there. It is.
Yeah.
So, So they
So
use
bourbon.
about 12 bushels of corn for 2 kegs. Wow.
Yeah, so this was I had a student ask me a question about what I thought about moonshiners, and I explained that whiskey is bourbon for people who lived in remote areas who were farmers. Bourbon was an easy way to get their product to market. That they could either transport 12 bushels of corn with their mule, or they could carry 2 kegs of whiskey. 2 kegs of whiskey is easier to carry. So which is the more efficient way to sell your product?
Huh.
And what do you get more money for? You get more money for the whiskey.
Yeah.
So it comes from Kentucky, and you have these remote areas in Appalachia. It's sold in sealed bottles, and it is a distinct product. And I'll talk about what that means, but it is a huge part of Kentucky identity. So, for instance, in 1890, there were almost 1,600 bourbon distilleries in Kentucky alone.
Woofda.
Yeah, and Kentucky's not that big a state. And so that's a huge number. In 1964, it was declared a distinctive product in the United States, which means it has protected status, which means you can't make a similar product somewhere else and call it bourbon. You can't change the formula. It laid out the rules about what it means to be bourbon and how you can label your product. Now, it's kind of interesting. Bourbon used to be relatively inexpensive, but as globalization has occurred and we have more and more people around the world in India and China entering the middle class, they want to buy those signifiers of middle class success. And one of those is Scotch. Now, Scotch was, it can only be produced in Scotland, so there's a relatively limited amount. And that drove the price of Scotch up. And as good Scotch is topped $100 a bottle, what happened is many drinkers turned to bourbon as a replacement for it because it was less expensive. And now bourbon's been discovered, the same sort of price escalation is happening with bourbon.
Well, it's a cycle. I mean, everything seems to have its moment in the sun. So
yeah,
we'll see.
So what makes bourbon? It has to be 51% corn. That's the primary ingredient in bourbon is corn. It usually comes around between 65 and 75%, depending on the recipe that they use. If it's over 80%, it's called corn whiskey. The other grains that are used depend on the distiller. They all have secret formulas. Oh, I want to put a little rye in there to get that flavor. Oh, I want to put a little rice in there to make it smoother. I want to put a little barley in there to give it a Scotch flavor. It just depends on the.
Well, I mean, that's how they distinguish themselves. So
exactly. Yeah. It commonly sold between 80 and 125 proof. 80 is much more common. Now, my personal favorite bourbon is Booker's Bourbon, and it is sold at what's called barrel strength. So we talked about that the new liquor was put into the barrel at about 125 proof.
Yeah.
And so Booker's it's not watered down to 80 proof. It is sold at barrel strength. So it's 125 proof. Every bottle is a little different because every batch is a little different. So it's around 125 proof. And I think that is about the highest alcohol content of any bourbon that's commonly available in the market.
Well, what's weird is that Booker's is smooth.
Yeah, Booker's is fantastic.
Yeah, even at the high concentration, it's
Yeah. So bourbon is put into new barrels. So we talk about they recycle barrels and they're used for other purposes. Well, bourbon uses new barrels. So they use white oak barrels and then they set them on fire. So that if you ever see the inside of a bourbon barrel, it looks like charcoal because it is charcoal. They burn them and then they add the liquor to it. And bourbon is aged for a minimum of 2 years. If you don't age it 2 years, you can't call it bourbon.
Yeah, and the longer it ages in barrel,
the
better it is.
And that brings up a good point. It only ages, like the quality only improves in barrel time.
Yeah.
Once it is bottled, it does not get better.
No.
So it's like, I found this 50-year-old bottle of Pappy Van Winkle. Well, it's probably good bourbon because it was good bourbon when it went in the bottle. but
Yeah.
it is no better because it's 50 years old now.
Yeah, it's not like, the wines where people are,
Yeah, it
coveting.
doesn't age in the bottle.
Yeah.
So some common whiskeys, brands that we encounter: Ancient Age, Jim Beam, Ezra Brooks, Maker's Mark, Old Crow, Old Grandad, Rebel Yell, Wild Turkey, and Evan Williams. Is there anything missing from that list?
There's quite a few missing from that list, but I think you are missing the biggest one. Am I wrong?
What's that?
That our buddy Jack should be on the list.
Well, that's an interesting one. And technically, Jack Daniels is not bourbon. And so we'll talk about that in a minute, that Jack Daniels is actually not bourbon.
Is that because they're from Tennessee and not from Kentucky?
That is part of it.
Mm,
That is part of it.
those darn strict laws.
Yeah. So Canadian whiskey.
So
Take
off, eh?
Yeah. So one thing about Canadian whiskey is it is typically spelled in the European manner without an E. So if you'll see at the top, I spelled it with an E, which is the American way. But in the text, I have it without an E because that's the European way. And that's so Scotch doesn't have an E. Irish whiskey doesn't have an E.
Yeah.
Bourbon does have an E. Canadian whiskey. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's semantics. I mean, it's like spelling color here and in the UK.
Yeah.
So
Canadian whiskey, not supposed to be more than 49% of any one grain. So it is a blend. What they're looking for is a smooth, repeatable flavor. They're not looking for like super distinctive flavors. They're looking for a smooth flavor, and they're looking for one that they can recreate this formula over and over and over with whatever grains are affordable at the time. Canadian whiskey uses used barrels. So they'll recycle their barrels, or they'll buy old bourbon barrels or things like that, old wine barrels. They're white oak. It's aged for at least 3 years, and it's not straight, so it's not any one grain. Okay. Some common Canadian whiskeys: Canadian Club, Canadian Mist, Lord Calvert, and Black Velvet. So these are the kind of whiskey, if you're going to make a mixed drink, you might as well use a Canadian whiskey because they're blended for a smooth, mild flavor. With good bourbons and scotches and other things, what they're looking for is kind of that distinctive flavor profile of what that whiskey is. So in order to get that, you shouldn't mix it with Coca-Cola or other things. Or Red Bull. The idea is you drink it neat or with just a little water, so you get the distinct flavor of that product. Whereas Canadian whiskeys are made to be mixed.
Yeah.
Irish whiskey. I love good Irish whiskey.
Yeah.
So it's made from a blend of grains, again, depending on the flavor profile that the distiller wants to create. It is made in a pot still. So these are batch whiskeys. So it's not made in a continuous still where you just pour in one end and take the product out the other. These are done in small batches. It's aged for a minimum of 3 years. And it is aged in used bourbon or sherry barrels. So they either buy bourbon barrels from the U.S. or sherry barrels from Spain, and that's what they age the Irish whiskey in. Some common brands.
I assume the sherry gives a nice flavor. So
yes, yeah, yes.
So the brands, Bushmills.
What's that?
Oh, the brands. Sorry, I interrupted.
Talk about that in just a second. But what you brought out about it giving us flavor, I've got a. I can't remember. I got a Scotch sampler, and it has like 6 different Scotches in it. Mm-hmm. And so like one has been aged in sherry barrels, one has been aged in used bourbon barrels, and it's really neat. You can taste the distinctions of the flavor. But yeah, back to the brands of the Irish whiskey. So, a little bit about Irish history. There was a lot of contention about Ireland politically. So Great Britain, famously, Henry VIII decided he wanted to get a divorce. The church wouldn't give him a divorce, so what did he do, Matt?
Um, I
He
don't
did a lot
know.
of things, but
Yeah. No, I honestly I don't know what he did.
well, one thing he did was he cut off his wife's head. He got
Yeah,
the
I didn't want to go dark.
so,
I don't know why.
so
Just
he did many things, but one of his wives get rid of him. He cut off her head. But another time he went to the Pope and said, you know what? My wife's not giving me any boy children. I want to get rid of her. So how about you just declare my marriage null and void? And we can say, what we'll say, she's actually my cousin, so let's just say it's not a valid marriage and just dissolve it. And the Pope said, not going to do that. I'm the Pope. You don't have any, you are subject to me. So Henry said, you know what? I'm now the head of the Church of England. I'm going to create my own church. We don't believe in the Pope anymore, and we're going to be Protestants. And so, bam, created Episcopalians, basically created the Church of England, and broke from the Catholic Church so that he could get a divorce. Well, the thing is, Great Britain is made up of many smaller countries. You have Wales, Scotland, Ireland. Well, Ireland was a Catholic stronghold. They fought a civil war over this, not wanting to be Episcopalian. And so there are, it's very contentious, a lot of violence. But Bushmills is Protestant whiskey, and Jameson is Catholic whiskey. And so it's,
all right. No, seriously, if you ever get over to Ireland, it is fantastic. I highly recommend it. Go visit some of the historical sites. Go to the prison in Dublin where they executed a lot of those people who were fighting in the war against Protestant and Catholics and
freedom fighters, terrorists, whatever.
Yeah, whatever you want to call them. The IRA. We Robbie and I have been alive long enough where we remember Ireland having bombings quite often.
Yeah, regularly. We hear about the Middle East and areas like that have bombings. Ireland used to be the violent spot.
Yeah. Ooh, light whiskey.
Light whiskey, not a lot to say there. It's very high proof. It is blended, and again, this is for making other things. Not a lot of flavor.
It's a nice cheap mixer.
Yeah, this is a cheap mixer. This is Hunch Punch, basically.
Yeah.
Rye whiskey. Now, rye, you can take it up to 160 proof. It's pretty strong. It is at least 51% rye. So, those little tiny rye seeds, that's a lot of these things. It's stored in barrels, in new barrels. So they use new barrels for rye. It's aged for at least 2 years, but 4 years is more common. And it's commonly blended with something else. It's not usually sold as straight rye, just because of the intensity of the flavor. And you know what rye tastes like? It's kind of got that sort of anise, spicy flavor to it.
Yeah, never been a fan.
No, not my thing. But and it's curiously enough, this is becoming more and more popular.
Really?
But one of the things I would tell you, if you spend a lot of money on a rye whiskey, do your research, because
and then go buy yourself a nice scotch.
What's that?
And then go buy yourself a nice scotch.
Yeah. Well, there's only about 2 or 3 almost all the artisan rye whiskeys, like the small batch rye whiskeys that you see, they're really expensive, are actually all using the exact same rye mash. They buy their rye mash from the same people. So the same people are making the rye, and then it's being bottled in all these different bottles.
Huh.
Yeah, so this is one of those where you want to do your research before you spend a lot of money. Yeah. Scotch. Now, I love Scotch. I can't afford to drink it. This is the thing. Good Scotch is delicious, and bad Scotch is terrible. And good Scotch is expensive. Also, generally, I don't drink much anymore anyways, but when I did, I really liked Scotch. So Scotch, what makes it Scotch? It has to be distilled and matured in Scotland. So this is one of those things that limits the amount of Scotch in the world. There's, Scotland's a tiny little country.
Yeah, it most definitely is. But that's
So
why they let it be bottled elsewhere, though.
yeah,
Because
which
otherwise there would be even less Scotch.
yeah, so it's distilled and matured in Scotland. It can be bottled elsewhere, and actually, there's some really good scotches that come from places like Japan.
Yeah,
Suntory Scotch is fantastic.
yeah. It's won awards, so yeah.
Yeah. So the barley is dried and smoked over peat. So in Scotland they have bogs. So in America we would call them swamps, but over there they call them bogs. And as what happens is in these bogs they have layers of compacted earth. They dig it up, and once it's dry it'll burn, and it gives off tons and tons and tons of smoke. So what they do is they take the peat out of the bog, they put it in a smoke room, and then they put the malted barley over it on screens, and they smoke it. And this is where the distinct smoky flavor of Scotch comes from.
Yeah.
So the barley is then mixed with water and yeast, and it's distilled up to about 120 to 140 proof. So it's repeatedly distilled to get to that point, and then it's put in barrels. So commonly Scotch is blended, and there's nothing wrong with a blended Scotch. The really expensive ones tend to be single, what are called single barrel, or small batch, where is just what it sounds like. So they're made in pot stills, and what comes out of that still is a batch, and so it's not, and then it's bottled and sold. Whereas with blended whiskeys, they will take that and they'll mix it with several different batches to come up with a certain flavor profile. So for instance, Johnny Walker Black is not a single malt Scotch. It is a blended Scotch. It's very good. The flavor is very smooth, but they're able to reproduce it year after year after year because they're able to mix these different flavors, different light whiskeys together to get the one that they want. Scotch is aged in bourbon or sherry barrels for a minimum of 3 years. And if it's sold in the U.S., it's a minimum of 4 years. And after,
so why did they make the U.S. version be a minimum of 4?
That's a good question. I do not have an answer. You're going to make me have to go look that
up. Sorry. I was just,
Next week, we're going to have someone else do the class with me, guys. So then it's blended, and Scotch is you see Scotches that are aged longer, 50 years or whatever, but 25 years is really about the max practical limit. One, because again, you lose to evaporation over time. So the longer it ages, the less you get. So, you start with a full barrel. After so many years, you're down to a half barrel. You have less Scotch to bottle and sell. And also, since Scotch is blended, they're blending these Scotches from different years to come up. So they'll put a little bit of a 12-year-old in it, a little bit of a 3-year-old, a little bit of a 7, to come up with the flavor they want. So they're, about 25 years is the max. When you see these small batch or single barrel Scotches like Macallan that are 50 years old, that is incredibly rare because there's simply not many of them. Unless someone was thinking in 1970, I think Scotch prices are going to go up in 50 years, so we should set some of these barrels aside. It just doesn't exist.
No. It turns out that there was, to call it whiskey in America, apparently it had to be 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought it was an interesting question.
Okay. So single malt. So I talked about single malt Scotch. So are the ones that are made from a single mash. So this is the grains are put in are malted. They go through distaste. The yeast grow on them. Then I take that and I throw it in a pot. And that one batch is cooked. And and so with single malt, if you have a good batch, it's fantastic. And you bottle that up and you sell it, you can sell it at a premium price because it's like, wow, this one tastes great. But if you have a bad batch, you can't do that. So single malt is more of a kind of a crapshoot when you're doing it. So it makes it more expensive versus previously when I was talking about the blended whiskey. Well, if one batch is a little better, is a little, say, saltier and the other one's a little milder, well, you can mix those together and get the flavor you're looking for. You can't do that with a single malt. So it is a lot more delicate. It's a lot rarer to get good to get the quality you want.
Yeah, pretty much this is going to be done by those who are really good at making Scotch. And
it's typically darker, and it typically can be aged longer. It's expensive. So, hey, Matt, I'm going to continue on. But if you would Google most expensive bottle of Macallan Scotch, and let's just see what the current most expensive bottle of Scotch is while I'm going through this. So there are different types of Scotch, and they have different flavors. So these are the different regions of Scotland. So in the lowlands, you have the mild and light flavored. And in the highlands, you get like a smokier full flavor that has some oak. And what's a flavor that comes from oak? Vanilla. So you're seeing vanilla notes.
$1.5 million.
And how old was it?
That was in 2018 when that came out. Let me see. Gosh, that's ridiculous.
So the Camel.
A 1926.
So that a 95-year-old batch of Macallan.
Yeah, must have been a good year.
Yeah, very, very expensive. Crazy expensive. Campbellton Scotches are briny and peaty. This is near the oceanfront and full of flavor. The Islay Scotches are very popular. These have a distinct flavor. They're pungent. They're salty. If you ever saw the TV show Parks and Recreation, where Ron Swanson drank Lagavulin, that was an Islay Scotch. I had a friend of mine give me a bottle of Lagavulin 16 a few years ago. And this is a very expensive, nice bottle of Scotch. Personally, I thought it tasted just like Robitussin. I do not care for Islay Scotches, but that's my personal, taste. But they're very popular, very expensive. Lagavulin 16 is an example. And then Speyside, which have a mild sherry-like flavor. So some common brands of Scotch, and these are named after the clans or the people who lived in the areas who made them. So Cragganmore, Dalmore, Dalwhinnie, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, Knockondo, Lagavulin, Talisker, and the Macallan. And the Macallan is the one that tends to be the super expensive bottles. Yeah. Scotch will last indefinitely in a bottle. It doesn't go bad. It just sits there. If it's under 12 years old, it's fine to blend it. It's fine for cocktails. If it's over 12, serve it neat or with just a splash of water.
I mean, you can, but make it into a cocktail. But that's just wrong.
Well, you can do anything you want, but
yeah. I would like to see somebody make a cocktail out of that $1.5 million. It's like $90,000 a pour.
That guy mixed it was in Diet Coke.
Oh, even worse. Yeah, Diet Coke instead of just regular even.
Yeah. So sometimes you'll see a bottle that's labeled sour mash.
Mm.
Now, sour mash is not the flavor. Sour mash is like sourdough bread. So with sourdough bread, what you do is you have what's called a starter, which is some dough from a previous batch that has the live yeast in it. And you add that to your new dough, and it puts the yeast in the bread and makes it grow. So sour mash is the same idea. We have a little bit of the wash that's left over from a previous batch that has the yeast and everything in it, and it tends to have this kind of distinct lactic acid culture in the yeast, and that's mixed with the new batch. And so that's where the yeast comes from in the new batch. So this is a method of, instead of having to use yeast, we use our leftovers from the previous batch to start the next batch, and that's what makes sour mash.
Mm.
Straight whiskeys have to be at least 51% of a given grain. So when it's straight, it's like, oh, this is straight rye whiskey, this is straight corn, whatever. Is 51%, has to be aged at least 2 years. Then we have Tennessee sipping whiskeys.
Tennessee.
Yeah, so Tennessee sipping whiskeys are very, very similar to bourbon. Although they do have a maple flavor that's not present in bourbon, and that's because the process that makes Tennessee whiskey is that the last step that it goes through is that they take maple wood, they burn it, make charcoal for it, and they filter it through the maple charcoal to make it smoother and also picks up a bit of the maple flavor. It's funny that there's some good documentaries about Jack Daniels, and they actually distill their own 160 proof whiskey that they use to start the fires to make their charcoal.
Well, I mean, if you're gonna use any kind of, fire starter, make it yourself.
So the common brands of Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniels is probably the most common, and then also George Dickel. Okay, so that's it on brown goods. Next, we'll talk about light goods.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.